Advent begins today. And Advent is a series of 4 Sundays. You know this well. It's a series of 4 Sundays in the Christian calendar that lead up to Christmas. And it's a time to prepare our hearts for Christ. He came in the past. He comes now in the present. And He is coming again at the end of all history. And so we remember that just as Jesus will come to judge the world at the end of history, so too He now comes into our lives and calls us to live for Him. And this is what Advent does. It reminds us that there is an end to history. This is part of what Advent does. Not just an end in that the timeline comes to an end, although that's part of it, but there is an end, a purpose towards which God is guiding all of history, that God's ends, God's purposes, God's plans are being drawn to completion in Jesus Christ. And that Christ will come both as Savior and Judge at the very end. The word Advent, in fact, means come or coming, and it speaks of Christ's coming. He came as the Prince of Peace, a baby born in a manger, but also God coming in wrath and judgment against sin. And so what Jesus says here in this passage in Mark chapter 13, as He's talking with His disciples gathered around the Temple Mount, is this: keep awake to this reality of my coming. Keep awake to this reality that God breaks into history both as the God of love and as the God who brings judgment against all sin and evil. Wake up, says Jesus, to who God really is and what God is doing. And I want to help us hear that this morning. During Advent, we are called to watch for Christ and to live for Him. Now, we've got to pay a little bit of attention to the context of what Jesus is saying here in Mark 13, and really the whole chapter fits together. And if you notice at the very beginning of chapter 13, the first verse says, as they were leaving the temple, one of the disciples said to Him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." And He was pointing towards the temple in Jerusalem. You can imagine them moving towards Jerusalem in the Gospels, and then they're arriving at Jerusalem, and they're standing outside or sitting outside. And the disciples are looking at those stones, and they're impressive to them, and naturally so, because the temple in Jerusalem that was built by Herod the Great, the second temple, was a very impressive building. And He says, "Look at these massive stones." And Jesus says, "Do you see all these great buildings? Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." And the disciples then respond, or Peter, James, and John, and Andrew ask, "Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign that they are about to be fulfilled?" And Jesus says to them, "Watch." Now, we've got to keep in mind this context, because Jesus, like many places in prophecy, Jesus has in mind 2 horizons. And I think the first one that He has in mind is something that is going to be coming up within the living generation that He is talking to there. And he says, in fact, later in this passage, that there will be some here who will not pass away before these things are fulfilled. So some of you are going to see these things with your own eyes. And He's got that near horizon, but then He also has a more distant horizon in mind, which is the end of all things, the coming of the Son of Man in glory. And He talks about both. But that near horizon is one that will happen within 40 years of when Jesus is sitting outside of the temple with His disciples. The build-up to it is already near at hand, because Jerusalem and all of Judea are under the thumb of the Roman Empire. And within a few years, the Emperor Caligula will come and will try to set up a statue to himself within the Holy of Holies of the Jerusalem temple. And the Jewish people will protest vehemently against that and will lay their lives on the line, blocking this marble statue on the roads as they're bringing it in. And that happens about the year 40. So, only, say, 10 years or 8 years after Jesus is teaching His disciples. And then about another 20 years after that, there will be a series of events where the governor of Judea, also a Roman, whose name is Gessius Florus, will come and will try to take a large amount of money from the temple in Jerusalem, because Nero, and you all know Nero, the famous emperor who's morally falling apart in Rome, Nero needs a lot of money for his big projects, his remodeling of the city of Rome. And so Gessius thinks he's going to do right by the emperor and get some money out of the temple. And that begins a resistance that sparks a full-blown revolution, the Jewish War that happened more or less between 66 and the year 70. And in the year 66, the Romans are trying to approach Jerusalem, and they're attacking the city of Jerusalem, and they're facing stiff resistance. But after some setbacks, Jerusalem is completely invaded by Titus, who is the young son of who is the emperor Vespasian. And Titus is able to fight his way through Jerusalem, fight his way to the Temple Mount, and then to even build ramps up to the Temple Mount and take over the temple. And somewhere in this terrible battle, the temple in Jerusalem is burned. And after it's burned, and during that conflagration, the Roman soldiers come in and loot the temple and take even things from the Holy of Holies. And you can see them here in the famous Arch of Titus, which is in Rome. It is still stands today and is an arch that was built as a part of the triumph to Titus, who brought back many slaves and many objects from Jerusalem and from Judea. In fact, 97,000 people were sold into slavery, which is hard to imagine. Over 1 million people died in this war. It was the largest war that Rome ever fought against one of its own provinces. And so this was a tremendous disaster where the temple, like Jesus said, was left with not one stone standing upon another. All that there is today is the Temple Mount, the large hill that would have held the temple, but the temple itself is gone. And so Jesus is first off speaking of that near horizon. He's saying this is going to happen. And he's saying when this happens, you need to flee. You need to get out, because the temple is no longer going to be the center of what God is doing in the world. The temple is no longer the center of God's worship. And in fact, I'm doing something new. And he talks a little bit about this a little bit later in the passage in verse 28 and following, where Jesus uses the image of the fig tree. He says, as soon as you see the twigs get tender and its leaves are coming out, you know something new is being born. And it's a little bit like that with the temple. Jesus is saying the old is dying out and is gone. The new is being birthed. So you don't need to be here to throw your lives at the Romans trying to save the temple. I'm doing something new. And in fact, he says in the Gospel of John that his body is the temple. And he says in 1 Peter that his people are all living stones that make up the temple. But the center of gravity is no longer the physical temple in Jerusalem. In fact, it will be destroyed within the living memory of the generation that is alive when Jesus is teaching his disciples. And the word that Jesus uses throughout, there's several words, but what Jesus says in this passage is we got to be watching for these things. We got to be on guard about these things. We got to be paying attention because something big is happening. That's the first horizon, this terrible destruction that will come upon Jerusalem. There's a second horizon that is the end of all history. And Advent is a time when we speak about the return of Jesus and his coming again as the judge of all the world, when we speak about the end. And you see this in verse 24, where Jesus says, in those days, following that distress. And so you kind of get a vision for something that is to come, a next chapter after the destruction of Jerusalem. In those days, and then verse 26, you will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And so there's this vision where Christ will come at the very end of time and will gather his people to himself and will judge the world. And that horizon is still out there. The word for it in the scriptures, all the way back in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament too, is the day of the Lord. In Joel 1:15, we read, alas, for the day of the Lord is near, and as destruction from the Almighty it comes. In Zephaniah 1:7, be silent before the Lord God, for the day of the Lord is at hand. Malachi 4:5, lo, I will send you the prophet Elijah before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. Paul in 1 Thessalonians 5:2 says, for you yourselves know very well that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. And Peter writes in his second letter, chapter 3, verse 10, but the day of the Lord will come like a thief. And then the heavens will pass away with a loud noise, and the elements will be dissolved with fire, and the earth and everything that is done on it will be disclosed. And so there is the day of the Lord that is still to come, the last day, the end. And it's the end of history as we know it, when God will wrap up this part of reality and will bring his people to himself. But it is also the end in the sense of God drawing all of history, all of life, all of humanity towards completion and perfection and righteousness and holiness and gathering them into his love. But it's not just love. It is holy love. It is burning love. For our God is a consuming fire, and we must not forget that even as God comes as the Prince of Peace, he also comes as the one who has the authority and the right and the necessity to judge. And all of us will be judged. In 2 Corinthians 5:10, Paul says, "For all of us must appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each may receive recompense for what has been done in the body, whether good or evil." And in Matthew chapter 25, we see Jesus on his throne in glory, separating the sheep from the goats. And the sheep are those who have placed their faith in him and have done the works of righteousness, even though they didn't always know what they were doing. And the goats are those who did not pay attention to what they should be doing. And we cannot earn our salvation through works, and salvation only comes by grace. But all of us are going to be called to give an account of our lives. What have we lived for? What have we done? What have we said? What are the ways that we have lived our lives? And I think sometimes we can kind of forget this and be lulled into a reality, some kind of an idea that Jesus won't look at anything that we've done in our lives, that it will just all kind of be a blur when we stand before him. A lot of people, I think, who don't take Jesus seriously at all believe that, and maybe think take Psalm 10 as their motto. Psalm 10 says that many people seem to think that God is dead, or that nothing bad will ever happen to us. We'll be free of trouble forever. But I think even sometimes we who believe and who love him and who seek him and who want to follow him, sometimes maybe we can be lulled into believing that God's harmless, that he's just a tame lion who blesses all of our plans and puts up with all of our faults. But Advent reminds us that God is Savior and Judge, that he's the one who loves us and the one who calls us to account. And Jesus is saying, wake up to that. The end is near. Now, we've got to notice a couple of things about this. Verse 32 is very important when we talk about the end in this season of Advent. Verse 32 says, "No one knows about that day or that hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." Now, this is a verse that has caused some consternation in Christian history because people have looked at this and great theologians have tried to ponder, what can it mean that not even the Son, not even Jesus himself knows when the last day is? But that is what Jesus told his disciples, what he told us, that not even the Son knows, only the Father. It is a secret that God the Father guards within his heart. And so anytime we have somebody talking about the end, we always want to keep in mind that no one knows when it will be, that it is not for us to predict the end. It is for us to live in watchfulness and in anticipation. And sometimes people make parlor games of trying to predict the end. Just a couple of years ago, Harold Camping, who through his family radio network predicted the end. Do you remember this? And so it was supposed to be May 21st, 2011, and here we are. And then October in 2011, but that one didn't come to pass either. And Mr. Camping suffered some health issues after that. I think that the stress of having two failed predictions really got to him. We aren't to predict. A couple of years ago, there was the Mayan calendar, right? And it was supposed to end in 2012, but that looks a little quaint now. And so we cannot know. And anytime somebody says, I know when the end is going to be, I think the proper question is, so do you know more than Jesus? Because he said he doesn't even know. And so that is not what we're to be about, but we are to be standing in watchfulness, in readiness. We got to keep awake, keep alert. And Jesus uses this vision in verse 34, this parable of a master going away from the house and leaving the servants in charge. Everybody's got a task. One of them's supposed to watch the door. He speaks of the 4 watches of the night. You don't know when the master's coming back, or you don't know when the thief is going to come. So you must be alert at all 4 of those watches: evening, midnight, rooster crow, or dawn. If he comes suddenly, do not let him find you sleeping. And this passage is really emphatic. I mean, Jesus uses 3 different words here, but each time he's trying to get across the same meaning, and he's talking about watching and paying attention. So notice this back in verse 5, watch out. Verse 9, be on your guard. Verse 23, be on your guard. Verse 32, be on your guard, be alert. Verse 34, keep watch. Verse 35, keep watch. Verse 37, watch. So Jesus uses 3 words, but each time it's hammering home that emphasis that we are to be awake and watching and alert and on guard. We're to be paying attention for Him and to be living for Him. And, watchfulness is our perpetual stance as Jesus' disciples. We are to be watchful people. What are we watching for? Well, we're watching for Jesus Himself. We're watching for Christ, and we're living for Him. And, this is what we're to be doing between His first coming and His second coming. We're to be watching. We're to be paying attention. Lately I've seen these signs in everybody's yards that say something like, be aware, motorcycles are everywhere. It's kind of like that, right? Be aware, Jesus is coming. Pay attention, Jesus is coming. And you know what? It's not just about Jesus coming on the last day, the thief in the night, the one who comes as judge and wraps up all of history. It's about Jesus coming now. And so we speak about Jesus coming in the past and Jesus coming in the future, but Jesus also comes and breaks into the present of our lives right now. So He does come now, and He speaks now, and He leads now. Are we paying attention? And when we pay attention, we got to be paying attention to Jesus and hearing Him and watching for Him. And I'm convinced that this kind of paying attention cannot happen if we don't have quiet spaces built into our lives. One of our modern neuroses is that we have a fear, I think, as a society, of silence, of quiet spaces, of times where we are doing nothing but just listening for God. And you know what? I think we have to learn to build those quiet spaces into our lives, because in my experience, you cannot hear Jesus if you're surrounded by noise. Sometimes that noise distracts us from what's most important. A couple of years ago, I went with someone to court. He'd gotten in trouble, and so I went with them. And the court was packed, and we were all sitting there in these kind of pews, these benches in court, and the judge was up in front trying to keep everything in control and maintain order. And there was a big sign that says, no cell phones, right? And so, I shut mine off as I go in. And as we're all sitting there in this packed out courthouse, somebody's cell phone goes off. And everybody kind of gets silent. And that person tries to discreetly pick it up and take the call and sneak out the back door. But the judge just roared. He's like, get that cell phone up here right now. I want that person in here right now. And this court will not continue until that cell phone is up here on my podium. So I think sometimes there are things that can distract us when the judge is standing right there before us. There are things that can distract us from what is most important, and maybe cell phones is one of them. But Jesus is saying, notice, pay attention. I'm coming. And not just noticing Him, but paying attention to what He's calling us to. I've been finding myself praying so often, Lord, help me to be awake to what You're doing and what You want me to be doing in this situation. Help me to notice what you would like me to be talking about, or who you'd like me to be interacting with, or help me to notice, Lord, what I should be saying in this conversation. And I've been trying to approach life with this idea that God will lead me and will be present. And I found that to be true. And I think this is what we're all called to be doing, to be watching for Jesus and living for Him. And it really comes from the basic idea that Jesus is present in the midst of our lives, that Jesus really is with us, that He really is leading us, that He really is up to something, and He wants us to be involved if only we will pay attention and keep our sight focused on Him and wake up to that. I'll tell you a story. You may have noticed this in the Mennonite World Review, but not long ago, a lady named Beth Steria, who works with the New York Mennonite Conference, was in a terrible and tragic car accident. And the Chin congregation in the state of New York heard about this and wanted to go and pray for her, but the conference minister, Gene Miller, he must have had a vision in mind of all 100 people from the congregation showing up with guitars and other musical instruments in her ICU, and so he was reluctant to let them know where she was, and he said, please, just pray for her from home. But then later that day, the Chin congregation had a prayer meeting, and they felt that the Spirit was calling them still to go and pray and be present with Beth Steria. And so they sent a text to Jean and said, tell us where she's at, please, so we can go pray for her. And Jean said this, when I read the text, the Spirit clearly spoke to me to not discourage them any longer, and I gave them the name of the hospital and Beth's room number. Then 10 people from the Chin congregation traveled more than 3 hours from Buffalo to Syracuse, where hospital staff allowed them into Steria's room. They prayed fervently for her. A remarkable and speedy healing process began. There you have two visions of people paying attention to what Jesus was doing and calling them to. You've got this Chin congregation that was able to hear the voice of Jesus saying, go pray for Beth. And then you had the conference minister who was also convinced by the Spirit that he was to let them come and be with her in her hospital room. I think that's what we're called to do, to keep awake for the ways that Jesus is present to us now, is breaking in, is coming to us, and is calling us to live for Him. And especially during this season of Advent, I want to invite all of us to be watching for Christ and keeping awake for Christ, and noticing what He's calling us to and doing it. Now, how do we keep awake for Christ? How do we pay attention to Him? I am convinced that without a rhythm of regular prayer, it is impossible to cultivate this kind of watchful, listening, awake attitude. I am convinced that without that openness to Christ that comes with prayer, we are not going to be able to notice the places in our lives where Jesus is coming to us and is calling us and is moving us. Right? And I think so often we kind of are like, is anything happening? And maybe we kind of imagine that Jesus came and Jesus will come again, but we're sort of in this long space where He is absent. But that is not Jesus' vision. He said He's going to be with us always, even till the end of the ages. He says, whatever you do to the least of these, you did to me. Jesus' vision is that He is going to be breaking in to our lives now, that He's going to be walking with us. And if we aren't paying attention to that, I don't think it's going to be possible for us to go out and live lives that are pleasing to God. I don't think we can follow Him if we aren't first paying attention to the way He's speaking to us and leading us in life. And the only place that I've seen that allows us to cultivate that place of watchfulness is prayer. And so, a lot of us pray and we ask for things, and that's part of what prayer is. But I think there's also a way in which we've got to learn to pray and simply be open to Christ. And so I want to challenge us all during this season of Advent, which is a season of watchfulness. Think about this. I want to challenge us. Could you take 15 minutes a day and just sit and watch for Jesus? Just be listening for Him. And just pay attention to Him. And what I think will happen, because what I notice in my own heart and what I've heard from others, is that the first thing that we'll have to do in that space of watchfulness is to notice where we're at and pay attention to our own emotions and our own feelings, because sometimes there will be this swirl of emotions that will happen and many different thoughts about what I ought to be doing. And if that happens to you, just have a little piece of paper and jot that stuff down so you can let those thoughts go. But I think sometimes we'll have to first pay attention to where we are and what's going on in our own hearts and minds before we can start to notice Jesus. And so I invite you to do that. Take 15 minutes during the season of Advent. Take it daily and notice where you're at, but then just kind of sit quietly and notice where Jesus is speaking to you and where he is leading you. Part of this comes from my conviction that Jesus is not absent from history, but does speak to us and does lead us and often convicts us of things that we ought to be doing or shouldn't be doing. And I think this is the way that we practice watchfulness, that we cultivate watchfulness, that we become a watchful people, is by creating this space where we are attentive to him and can begin to hear what he is calling us to. You know what? We don't know when the Son of Man will return. And we don't know now when he is going to show up and speak to us, and often it's not when we expect. But if we cultivate that watchfulness, I think we can be the kind of people who are receptive to what Jesus is doing in our lives and receptive to what Jesus wants to lead all of history towards. This is what Advent is about. It's about taking Jesus' words to heart and keeping awake and being watchful and being on guard. When the Son of Man comes, he will come suddenly. So let him not find us asleep. Instead, may he find us awake and watching. Amen.